My name is Dave. I am the new Bob with the BC Baptist Association, and so it's just a pleasure to be with you and to visit you here at your beautiful church. I have not spent a lot of time in this area before, and I got to tell you, it is absolutely beautiful. Man, I love it here. So, anyway, such a pleasure to be with you. You know, I bring greetings. As you maybe saw in that video, it was a Christmas video we sent out, and I think Steph suggested we show that so you could just see that I was not, in fact, Bob. But get a little bit of greetings from some of the other churches in our association as we're continuing to be on mission together. So I bring you greetings from across the entire province, actually. I'm taking this first year of my role. I've been in it about 10 months or so. And I'm taking this first year to try to visit as many churches as I possibly can. And to try to just get a sense of who you are, and then you get a sense of who I am, as we determine, in fact, where God would have us go. I'm so excited to do that. I'm so excited to be a part of that. And so you need to know that there are very exciting things happening with your sister churches all across BC. I won't go so far as to say there's a revival happening yet, but I think it's on its way of happening in BC, in northern BC, in Prince George area. We just planted a church up there that Bob was a part of preceding, and I got on the tail end of it. And they are already regularly having well over 70 people in regular attendance. They baptize people regularly. Over 50% of the people who joined that congregation at its launch date were not yet churchgoers. That's how effective that is happening there. They're leading people to Jesus, and they're telling them about this truth that, hey, in fact, yes, there is one solution. There's one solution to life, and it's found in the person, Jesus Christ. And so God is doing a work up in Prince George area. God is doing a work in our Vancouver area churches, and God continues to do a work here. So I would say, from my standpoint and on behalf of the association, I want to thank you for being a part of that. Thank you for partnering with us on our mission to spread the love of Jesus. It's so exciting to be a part of a big team. I absolutely love that. Well, if you have your Bible or an app or whatever it is you're going to use today, I'd invite you to turn to Romans chapter 12. I'm really looking forward to digging into Romans chapter 12 with you. We're going to read the first two verses. Now, if you've been a follower of Jesus for a long time, you've heard these verses before. You've heard that you've read them, whether it was in your own personal quiet time, or whether it was a preacher person kind of guy like me, or Bible studies, whatever it is, devotions, whatever it is. You have read these verses before if you've been following Jesus for a long time. One of the most familiar passages in the Bible because we quote it so often. So let's listen as I read it here this morning. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Now notice the very first word in those verses. The very first word we read is therefore. Now, whenever you read in the Bible and in our English translation, if you ever read the word therefore, you need to ask yourself that first logical question, what is it there for? Because it precedes, there's something that precedes it. And he's saying this, all the stuff, now everybody needs to understand this, is what Paul is saying. All the stuff that are written in the first 11 chapters, to this point, what I'm going to do now, in verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 1, I'm going to call you to that kind of life. The first 11 chapters. A life that's built on something lasting. He's saying it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's rooted in something. And what is it rooted in? He gives us the answer. He says it's rooted in God's mercy. God's mercy. God's mercy, it's a plural form of a word. It's not just singular, it's God's mercy, mercies, lots of God's mercy. It perfectly sums up, is what Paul wants to say, the truth of God and the truth of His relationship with us, found in chapters 1 through 11. So listen again to verse 1. He says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." So as we begin today, despite the risk of oversimplifying those incredible words of this incredible text, let me attempt to give you an 8-word summary, just my own paraphrase of the first 2 verses. Your entire life should be a living sacrifice. Does it sound like a big deal? It is. Does it sound easy? It isn't. What kind of life do I need to live if I am going to constantly and consistently sacrifice myself? You know, you ask almost anybody what they think of when they think of religion, and they'll come up with something like this. They'll say it's a belief system, something like that, or it's a particular way of living. And actually, they wouldn't be that far off. It's you practice certain practices, right? You behave in a certain way because of what you believe. But in the ancient world that Paul was writing to here at this time, religion was thought more in terms of this word, sacrifice. That's how they thought of it. Religion was about trying to make things right. And you did it by offering a sacrifice. You do the right things to please the right God, or the right gods, as it were, and do it in the right way. And it's actually really no different than what all religious systems and religion is after. It's religious behavior for the express purpose of just going to wipe my slate clean. I'm going to make sure that I behave properly so that I can wipe my slate clean. See, and in that case, if making a sacrifice is simply a religious behavior, then Paul would have us know, particularly as we read through, that it's actually hollow. It's empty. Saying that's not real religion. See, as Paul talks about in the first half of Romans, the first 11 chapters, that's what an empty religion type of thing does, but it's not what Jesus was about. He says you don't have to offer sacrifices anymore to make up for your sins. It's just not like that anymore. Jesus did it once for all. It's final. That's what the first 11 chapters of Romans are about. You see, if a quick sacrifice wipes my slate clean, then what's my motivation to avoid the bad decision the next time? I mean, it easily becomes just an abuse, right? An abuse of what God intended with the old system of sacrifice. Oh, I'm going to do this behavior because I can just clean it up later. See, what it comes down to is this, is that a sacrifice without the right attitude is just this hollow gesture that's just based on an action rather than being based on the heart. So in view of all that God has done, is what Paul's saying, in view of all of His mercies, we offer a sacrifice. But it'll be just a different kind of sacrifice than you'd think at first glance. The sacrifice will be us, you and me, a living one. It's a living sacrifice that flows out of a sincere heart. Now notice we didn't say that it flows out of what we say. It doesn't flow out of what we do. It doesn't even flow out of how we say or how we do it. Paul wants us to know that this is the thing that pleases God. If you give something away that you have no stake in, no connection to, it doesn't cost you anything, it's not a sacrifice. See, at best it's actually convenient, but it's actually pretty impersonal. It's the same as an act of sacrifice that comes from an insincere heart. The one thing it isn't is worship. Now, there's something just so significant about verse 1 that I have often passed over. Before Paul describes a life of sacrifice as being merciful to others, the rest of chapter 12 is filled with that. He describes it as something else before that. He describes it as worship. See, being a follower of Jesus is more than being merciful to people. It has everything to do with being worshipful to God. That's what he's saying. Listen again, he says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. In other words, in view of God's mercy, your sincere sacrifice is offered to Him. Before we focus all of our energy on being merciful to people around us, which we should do. Before we do that, we give ourselves away in worship to God. That's exactly what he's saying. See, a life of sacrifice is first and foremost a response to God in worship. This is big. This is really big. Yet I think it's fair to say that we miss this a lot of the time. I do all the time. If you're a follower of Jesus, this is specifically for you. See, we can't let ourselves drift into mere social agenda and social justice and just doing the right thing. And I say mere carefully, because if God has left out our mercy, will be just social agenda, which is good. And if you're not a follower of Jesus yet, I would say just keep doing it. It's the right thing to do. Serve other people. But see, here's the point, is it can be so much more than just good mercy. See, it's a beautiful thing for anyone to give the hungry something to eat. But how much more beautiful, knowing that God decided that they were worthy of his mercy long before you did. Jesus' followers show mercy out of the value they see in others because of the value that God gave them long before you did. See, put it this way, the things we do, the sacrifices we make that flow out of a sincere heart, they are actually an expression of God's worth more than the individual. That's why people of the Grove want to impact their community. That's why people of the Grove want to reach out to their neighbors. That's why people of the Grove want to serve the community in the way they do, because of the value that God says the people around you have. But if all the ways we sacrifice our time and our energy, our resources, if they're not an act of worship first, then in the end, we actually may not have even been merciful. See, we serve not that we can be seen, but so that others, frankly, can see Jesus and the value that God has given him. The defining characteristic of Jesus' follower is a life of worship so that it can be merciful. If we're not worshiping in our behavior, that is, if God's mercy is in us, in the gift of Jesus, if they don't go hand in hand with our behavior, we're not giving people what they actually need the most. See, the mercy of God is the relentless pursuit of his people, both when they need him and when they think they don't. It's what followers of Jesus have experienced before they even started to know and follow. See, that's God's mercy. It inspires us, motivates us. It drives us, in fact, to live a life where sacrifice becomes an everyday act of worship. See, it's so much more than what we do on a weekend. It's not about that one great song, and there were many great songs this morning, that transported us perfectly into that right worship mood, and my emotions were perfectly there. It's more than that one sentence prayer in the morning, at night, or with the kids before they go to bed. The living sacrifice, says Paul, it carries a posture throughout the day that is actually tuned into the same things that God is. It's more than a moment. It's more than a song. It's more than a prayer. It's who we are all the time. There have been times in my life when I have said to God, I can't. It's too hard, God. Oh, this is too distracting. It's going to take too much effort, and I have other things I got to do. God, I can't. Have you ever said things like that to God? Maybe consciously or even subconsciously. Maybe it's that time when you were wrestling through, that issue that you just couldn't seem to get a handle on. You couldn't seem to get victory over that issue. And so you said to God, I can't, God. Or maybe it was just following through with doing the right thing. That right thing that you knew you should have done. You knew you were supposed to do it, but you struggled to go all the way, and so you said to God, God, I just can't. See, it can be so hard, right? Almost impossible. Every moment of every day, we ask God that. Really? But God, you don't know what my work life is like. My boss is impossible. Living with my family. God, come on. Really? They're a hot mess. They have no idea how to do life, and they make it hard for me too. God, I can't do it. Or God, just my friends, my neighbors, they don't get it. They don't understand. In fact, they're so persuasive in their own beliefs, I don't know if I can believe mine. You know what? I've learned something about myself, and it may be true about you as well. It's usually not so much a case of I can't, as much as it is I won't. Some of us don't even let it get to the point of saying I won't, because before we even get there to that point to decide, we say, I don't even know if it's worth trying. You see, if we cut right to the heart of the problem, we see that actually the heart is the problem. When we let other things take a priority over God, they become the most important thing to us where? Right here, in the heart. Remember the first commandment of the Big Ten? You shall have no other gods before me. You know, Jesus addressed that regularly. Specifically when it came to how we act in the everyday kind of stuff. In Mark 7:21, he said, out of man's hearts, and then he lists, comes a whole bunch of junk. A whole bunch of things. You see, in those moments, you and I have a choice. We have a choice to live moment by moment, day by day. Trying to let my entire life be an act of sacrifice, an act of worship. Let me get really practical just with you for a moment. Hey parents, what would your relationships with your kids look like if when you were with them, when you were talking with them, you actually made that an act of worship? Students, say, do you think homework would be nearly as tough to do if you did it as a way of honoring God? As a way to say, God, I'm just so grateful for you. I'm going to give it my best shot. Would conflict in your relationships be easier, or would they be harder if you realigned how you talked? If you determined that the actual words you would say, the words that would come out of your mouth, would honor God as a way to worship Him? Would conflict be easier or harder if we did that? You see, every single part of our day can be an act of worship. An act of worship that pours out of a sincere heart. The struggle can be immense, but if there's one thing that life teaches, when we don't worship and honor God in all that we do, we worship something or someone else. And that, despite that there's only one God who's worthy of our worship. That's what a life of sacrifice is about. It's about relinquishing my desire to do my own thing and then present that as an offering to God. That's what Paul is referring to. That's a living sacrifice. I relinquish my desire, God, and I put it on for your desire. Now, verse 2 of Romans 12 is one of the most quoted verses in the entire Bible, but we actually should never read verse 2 without reading verse 1 first, because verse 1 in Romans 12, 1 and 2 is about the how. So verse 1 again, he says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. And then he says this, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. See, verse 2 is the how to verse 1. Now that word conform, it's an important word there. It's the word that we get our English word for scheme from, a scheme. We all know what a scheme is. It's all about to be perceived in a certain way and to make sure strategically that that's how people's perceptions are. It's all about intentionally pursuing the appearance of the outside but forgetting or neglecting the inside. It also means fashion, to scheme and to fashion. To fashion something to look into a certain way. Put those together and what you get is Paul is saying, hey, don't allow yourself to change the outside so that it just looks good to everybody around. Don't allow yourself to just focus on the outside, the external. You know, I remember I saw a commercial a long time ago, and I think it was, I might have been having insomnia or something, one of those middle of the night things, and this will tell you how old I am, because I got up in the middle of the night, turned on the TV, and there was an infomercial on. And I don't even know if they exist anymore, because everybody just goes online. And what I saw was this guy doing push-ups. And he was trying to sell a product, and I brought one here this morning. Anybody seen any of these? Are you familiar with them? There should be 2 of them. They're called push-up helpers. And I remember seeing these things, and I looked at that fella on the screen, and he was just totally ripped. And I thought to myself, yeah, I want to look like that. Fortunately, I had enough common sense that I decided not to buy them because it was 4 easy payments of $13.99 plus $75 shipping or something like that. And I determined this is probably not the best course of action. So, I mean, I'm gullible. I'm not cheap. So I didn't buy them. Later on, I did find them at a thrift store for $1.99, which probably should have been my first clue, actually, because they were heavily discounted. So I bought these, and I got to tell you, I use them religiously, at least for 2 or 3 push-ups. Just about killed me. Have you ever tried these things? They are so hard. They've got this, I mean, they just make you work so. I did find a good use for them, though. At night, when I'm watching TV on the couch, if you stick this between the couch cushions, you set a plate of nachos on there, and I'm telling you, you can get the other side so easily. I mean, it's just fantastic. Some of you are judging me right now, and I just want to remind you of that Suzanne Summers Thigh Master in your basement, or that treadmill that's folded underneath your bed that is full of dust. Okay, let's leave it there. You know, here's the problem with what so many of us deal with. We get so focused on the outside stuff. The things that we think people think are important. Conforming our outside. Hey, do you get caught up trying to keep up, honestly? You got enough likes on Instagram or TikTok? Do you dress or talk the right way? Do you feel like you fit in? Maybe you're young parents and you feel the pressure to be like all the other parents, to make sure your kids have all the right toys, to do all the right sports, do everything just like everyone else. See, the problem is thinking, I want people to see me this way, when it really only matters that God sees me His way. See, woven through the first 11 chapters of Romans, Paul tells us all about God's mercies, clarifying not only who He is, but listen to this, who we are because of Him. Listen to some of these incredible truths that are found earlier in the book of Romans, first 11 chapters, and I'll just blitz through them. Romans 3:23 says, it doesn't matter how good we are at sacrificing to others, we'll never be good enough because, he says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 5:8, Paul says that God's mercy showed us how much He loved us. It says, God showed His great love for us by sending Christ to die for us. When? While we were still sinners. We weren't perfect yet. And God said, yeah, I'll die for them. We see God's mercies in chapter 10, verse 9. If you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and you believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. That's God's mercies to you and I. See God's mercies. Those are the things, folks, that make you and I who we are. God's mercies. Paul is saying that you're not defined by your performance. Your talents, your gifts, all those sweet skills that you have, they're all good. But God's kindness, God's mercy, those are the things that make you who you are. Who I am is built on what is done in me and through me because of Jesus. It's not what I can do or cannot do. It's not what I can say or cannot say. It's not what I have done or have not done. It's only what He's done and what He's doing. See, here's why I think it's really dangerous for us to define ourselves by anything other than the mercies and the grace of God. The first reason, and I'll just give you, it's a very practical reason. When all of those things that we're holding tight to, when all of those things disappear, and they always do, by the way, we're left with nothing. So we're forced to suddenly define ourselves or redefine ourselves by the next thing. You see it all the time. We see it all the time in our time and place in our culture, people redefining who they are by who they want to be, as opposed to who God has made them to be. But let me give you the other reason why I think it's so dangerous about redefining ourselves. And it's the only reason I think we really need to be aware of. When we define ourselves by anything other than Jesus, we begin to hold on to those things so tightly that it's almost impossible to let them go. See, living the kind of sacrificial life that God asks is impossible when we're more worried about conforming the outside than transforming the in. I said earlier that the words for scheme and fashion come from the same word for conform. You know what another English equivalent word for transform is that he goes into here? Metamorphosis. It's that process of change that starts on the inside. See, a life of sacrifice is marked by transformation right here. Interesting fact about transformation. While it always starts on the inside, it always shows up on the outside. See, what Paul is doing in Romans 12, 1 and 2, he's brilliantly showing us that to be a living sacrifice, it flows out of a sincere heart. To be a living sacrifice is an everyday act of worship, moment by moment thing. To be a living sacrifice doesn't conform to what looks good on the outside, but is actually transformed first on the in. The transformation is actually the result of everything else that preceded it. It's about what God has done for you and I in the past, but now. And this is what Paul really wanted us to know. What he continues to do now inside us. New Living Translation says this way, and I really like it because I think it's pretty accurate. Let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Now, don't let the first word of that verse slip you by that I just read. Let. Let God transform you. We don't need to spend a lot of time going over the opposite of what letting God transform you looks like. It's as simple as saying, don't let God transform you. Kind of drives the point home, doesn't it? I think Eugene Peterson says it really well in the Message. He says, let God bring the best out of you. Oh, that sounds great, doesn't it? There's a big part of our role. Is that word let. Let God transform you. We decide to let God transform us into a new person. It's actually what it all comes down to. Letting God transform you. You know, my dad passed away a number of years ago. And I remember, I have such fond memories of my dad right from the time I was this high all the way through till now. You know what I remember? A couple of things that I remember most. As I reflect on my dad's life, I remember I have this overarching impression and feeling of him that he was so strong. I remember my dad being so strong. Right from the time I was about 10 years old, I grew up in my teen years on a farm. My dad would be out in the field, midsummer day, about 10 in the morning, and it was my job as a 10-year-old to run out and give him his coffee for coffee break. He would sit for 5 minutes and have a coffee break in the middle of working a swather or a combine or whatever he was on at that time. It was always at 10 o'clock, 5 minutes, and I'd bring him this big hot thing of coffee, and it would be 30, 35 degrees outside, and I'd watch him open that cup out of that old Stanley mug, and I'd see him pour it in there, and I'd watch the steam. It was so hot that even it was hotter than the air. It steamed up, and I'd watch him, and I'd think to myself, is he really going to drink that just like that? And I watched my dad just take it. He was so strong. As a 10-year-old, I thought, I can't believe he's so strong to drink coffee like that hot. It was incredible. I watched him in his later years get diagnosed with cancer. And I watched him say, when the doctor said, you've probably only really got about this long to live, and I watched my dad say, I disagree with you. And he lived this long. He just was so strong. There was just something about him. I watched him work through being working a cutthroat business world, somehow managing to survive and even thrive. I watched him retire from business only to buy a farm and work full-time till he was about 75 on a farm. Honestly, he was just so strong. And yet, you know what else I remember about my dad? I was standing at his bedside a few years ago, and he was in his last moments, struggling to breathe and all that stuff. And I held his hand, and I said to him, how you doing, Dad? And he looked up at me, voice was weak, body was shaking, and he said, I'm doing okay. And he passed away about 3 minutes later. I remember thinking to myself, man, my dad was so strong. But you know what else I remember about my dad? I remember him placing an incredible value on what God said and what God believed about him. I would walk by my dad's and my mom and dad's bedroom at night, or sometimes early in the morning if I managed to get up before them. And I would hear him kneeling at his bed. I would hear him praying for us, for the rest of the kids, the family, whatever was going on in the world at that moment. You know, what I remember about my dad is he understood who he was before Almighty God. His posture put himself in a place where he was in full submission to a Savior who said, I want to transform you. Don't be conformed to anything else. Be transformed by me, what I've done, and what I continue to do in your life. Be transformed. You see, I think it doesn't matter how strong we think we are. It doesn't matter how accomplished we think we are, the things we've achieved, whatever it is, our posture before our holy God is really what matters. Our text in Romans is really challenging. What are my priorities? How do I align my priorities with God's? You know what? I think it comes down to our posture. A life of sacrifice is dependent on our posture. If you're a follower of Jesus, your life should be about something different, folks. What drives you? That's a question. What motivates you? What guides you? Listen, here's a question for you. What inspires you? What transforms you? What makes our lives a living sacrifice? Well, today I brought a little gift for you all from the BC Association. And it's a little card like this. If you haven't been given one yet, they will be available at the Welcome Center, Welcome Desk. Please grab one on the way out. It's a little prayer called the Prayer of Relinquishment, and it's from a book by Richard Foster. He wrote this a number of years ago. I would ask you to take this, and if you are feeling so courageous enough, what I would ask you to do is to pray this prayer every day. To put yourself in the posture where you can pray this prayer every day. In a moment, we will pray it all together. I will pray it, and you can just bow your head and listen. Pray along with me in your heart. But what I would encourage you to do is Take the card, and if your fridge is magnetic, stick it on the fridge with a magnet. Some fridges aren't anymore. Stick it on your bedside table if that's a good place for it, or put a piece of tape on your mirror in the morning, or stick it on the visor of your car, whatever it is, and use this as a very intentional prayer to God once a day. I would encourage you to do that. See, this is the kind of posture that I would love for all of us, all followers of Jesus everywhere, let alone, of course, our BC Association churches all across this province. If we adopted this posture, you know what I think would happen? God would transform us, and the result would be transformation of everything around us. Those neighbors that you know that have yet to make a decision or even shown an interest in Jesus, I wonder what they would decide if they saw you living this out. I'm going to pray it right now, and I'm going to ask you to bow your heads. I'm going to ask you to pray along with me, and then we'll close. Today, O Lord, I yield myself to you. May your will be my delight today. May your way have perfect sway in me. May your love be the pattern of my living. I surrender to you my hopes, my dreams, my ambitions. Do with them what you will, when you will, as you will. I place into your loving care my family, my friends, my future. Care for them with a care that I can never give. I release into your hands my need to control, my craving for status, my fear of obscurity. Eradicate the evil, purify the good, and establish your kingdom on earth. For Jesus' sake, amen.